For roughly 1,000 years, from about 500 to 1500 CE, bestiaries were some of the most popular and widespread pieces of literature to ever exist, at times second only to the Bible. As we saw in part 1 of this video, medieval bestiaries described and illustrated exotic and sometimes unbelievable creatures, and the sense of wonder they elicited knew no societal restrictions. Bestiaries fascinated everyone from royalty to peasants. But while there were many volumes of bestiaries circulating throughout the Middle Ages, it appears that just about each and every one of them can trace their inspiration back in time to an original compilation of animals known simply as the Physiologus, a kind of precursor to the bestiaries with which we've become familiar. Today, dear traveler, we'll explore the roots of the medieval bestiary in more detail, ending with the legacy their popularity left behind even millennia after their cultural usefulness faded. Interestingly though, as we'll see, there are some who would argue that they were never useful in the first place. For now though, let's take a look at a few more of the creatures these compendiums present, along with their increasingly bizarre descriptions. As we've seen, many of the creatures described in bestiaries were either very real, or at least based on real animals. Even so, it's clear that when it came to some of these creatures' alleged behaviors, the medieval authors were doing little more than making uneducated guesses. One of the best examples of these strange interpretations is the whale. To the ancient observer, whales were shrouded in mystery. As we know, many whales feed by passing through a large school of fish, or perhaps krill, mouths agape, scooping up as much food as possible. But to the medieval mind, this simple method of hunting was perhaps too simple. The nature of this animal is such that when it feeds, it opens its mouth and breathes out from it a kind of sweet-smelling odor, so that when smaller fish scent it, they gather in its mouth. When the whale feels that its mouth is full, it closes it suddenly and swallows the fish. Why the addition of a fragrance emanating from the whale's open mouth? Well, partly because this is the description given by the Physiologus, which many medieval bestiaries cite, sometimes verbatim. But more than that, it's also likely that seemingly superfluous details like this were added to make their moral more impactful. For example, just after the description listed previously, the Aberdeen bestiary continues. They suffer in the same way, those who are of limited faith, who succumb to the food of desires and enticements. They are suddenly devoured by the devil as if they had been overwhelmed by certain scents. The whale itself is an excellent example of a larger theme present throughout the medieval bestiaries. Many times, the main purpose of an animal's inclusion had very little to do with the animal itself. Indeed, many times the authors were far less concerned with whether a creature actually existed or if their descriptions were accurate, and more concerned with the ideas they represented. As 20th century theologian Charles Raven put it, the whole attitude towards nature was emblematic. Men did not study flowers or birds for their own sakes or in order to learn from them new insights into reality. They went to them solely for illustrations of moral or metaphysical dogmas, accepted on authority and believed to be divinely ordained. They sought in nature not knowledge, but edification, not enlightenment, but the exemplification of preconceived ideas. It could be argued that, given their disinterest in empirical facts, these bestiaries were little more than a compilation of fairy tales. This conclusion, however, shouldn't discount their significance, if only as a window into the culture that gave them life. But in speaking of the whale, ancient descriptions had much more to say. One of the largest of these creatures, called the Aspidocelion, was said to be as large as an island and heavier than sand. Sailors, thinking this giant organism to be nothing more than an island, would often anchor their ships to it, even venturing onto the whale's back and cooking a meal. Alas, however, once the whale began to feel the heat of their fire, it would dive, dragging the ships and the poor sailors down to the depths. Now, though, we'll move our attention from the deep ocean to the River Nile. Here, high above where the crocodile and hydrus engage in their eternal struggle, flies the pelican. This version of the pelican, however, is quite unlike anything we're familiar with today. The most obvious difference is that in virtually every illustration of the time, the pelican's characteristic pouched beak is entirely absent. It's difficult to say why this is, as earlier writers would have almost certainly illustrated them correctly. In his Natural History, for example, Pliny the Elder writes that pelicans have a second stomach in their throats, in which the insatiable creatures place food, increasing their capacity. Later, they take the food from that stomach and pass it to the true stomach. This appears to be a perfectly adequate description of the pelican's throat sac, but over the next few centuries, as we've already seen, anatomical accuracy becomes less and less important. In Etymologies, Isidore of Seville briefly mentions the pelican, It is said that she kills her offspring and grieves for them for 3 days, then wounds herself and sheds her blood to revive her sons. There are 2 kinds, aquatic and solitary. Here we read some very outlandish claims, but to his credit, it's clear that Isidore has some doubt as to the veracity of the behaviors he lists. For now, however, the long beak remains. Interestingly, using this simple description as a springboard, the 12th century Aberdeen bestiary does almost entirely away with anything resembling true observational commentary, devoting much of its entry on the pelican to the symbolism it represents. When the pelican gives birth and the young begin to grow, they strike their parents in the face, but their parents, striking back, kill them. On the 3rd day, however, the mother bird, with a blow to her flank, opens up her side and lies on her young and lets her blood pour over the bodies of the dead, and so raises them from the dead. In a mystic sense, the pelican signifies Christ. It weeps ceaselessly for its young as Christ wept with pity when he raised Lazarus. Thus, after 3 days, it revives its young with its blood, as Christ saves us, whom he has redeemed with his own blood. In a moral sense, we can understand by the pelican not the righteous man, but anyone who distances himself far from carnal desire. By Egypt is meant our life, shrouded in the darkness of ignorance. Because of its astounding ability to resurrect its young and its obvious parallels to Christ, the pelican was a significant icon throughout the Middle Ages. It was formed into sculptures, adorned family crests, and was even worn by royalty. Indeed, there was much to be learned from the pelican, each aspect of its biology a lesson from its creator. Of course, it's also one of the best examples of bestiary authors seeking religious edification to the nearly full exclusion of actual observational knowledge. From the Odyssey to Mandeville's travels, the ancient and medieval world had no shortage of stories and catalogs of amazing creatures. In these books, at times, the line between reality and fantasy was blurred, so much so that it almost seemed like they were describing an entirely different world. Today, writers, video game designers, and dungeon masters create similar fantastic worlds. The problem is, as these worlds grow, it can be difficult to keep track of everything. But with World Anvil, even the most complex world building is a breeze. With its robust tools, you can write up detailed accounts for each of your species, races, and regions, and use the built-in auto-linker function to keep track of how they relate to or descend from one another. Or you can start by importing a detailed map and then link each of your species' profiles to their geographic location, making it easy to visualize your creation from a planetary view. Plus, World Anvil is always adding new features. Recently, they added Chronicles, which takes some aspects of one of my favorite features, the Timeline Creation tool, and allows you to connect important events with their location on a map. You can even link articles such as your species profiles to these world events and their locations, which can take your creation from a dull sequence of events to a living, breathing, fully interconnected world. And once you've forged your fantasy, sci-fi, or spec evo world, all of your entries are completely searchable. Gone are the days of documents and scattered folders. With World Anvil, the only thing holding you back is your own imagination. So if you want to try out World Anvil for yourself, just visit worldanvil.com and enter the code ThoughtPotato at checkout for a whopping 40% off an annual plan. So whether you're a novelist, a dungeon master planning your next campaign, or looking to create an alien planet from scratch, if you've had an idea for a world-building project and just haven't figured out where to start, check out World Anvil today and get started. Links are in the description. For thousands of years, beavers have been hunted for castoreum, a yellowish substance contained in so-called castor sacs at the base of their tails. Through the ages, castoreum was, and still is, used as a food additive, a perfume, and in the old days as a treatment for a surprisingly wide variety of medical issues. As you might be able to guess, a substance with that many uses was highly sought after in the ancient world. But somewhere along the line, pre-modern people began to believe that the beaver's castoreum was housed in its testicles. They also believed that the beaver was aware of the reason it was hunted, and it often took drastic measures to save its own life. Aesop's Fables, which first circulated in the 6th century BCE, describes this behavior in some detail. It is said that when the beaver is being chased by dogs and realizes that he cannot outrun them, he bites off his testicles since he knows this is what he is hunted for. As soon as the hunter lays his hands on that magical medicine, he abandons the chase and calls off his dogs. This self-mutilating behavior is retold as fact in the 1st century BCE by Pliny the Elder, in the 2nd century by Aelianus and the Physiologus, in the 3rd by Solinus, the 7th by Isidore, and the list goes on. The moral of this behavior, especially for Aesop, was simple. We are to employ any means necessary, sacrificing any vice to ransom our own life. Few descriptions focus on any other aspects of the beaver's behavior, though there are exceptions. In Topographia Hibernica, for example, Gerald of Wales describes the manner in which they build their fortress in the bed of a river, collecting and conveying oak boughs from the woods to the water. The medieval bestiary, however, was much less concerned with the beaver's other characteristics and day-to-day behaviors. Instead, Aesop's lesson is tweaked slightly. There is an animal called the beaver, which is extremely gentle. Its testicles are highly suitable for medicine. Physiologus says of it that, when it knows that a hunter is pursuing it, it bites off its testicles and throws them into the hunter's face, and, taking flight, escapes. But if, once again, another hunter is in pursuit, the beaver rears up and displays its sexual organs. When the hunter sees that it lacks testicles, he leaves it alone. Thus, every man who heeds God's commandment and wishes to live chastely should cut off all his vices and shameless acts and cast them from him into the face of the devil. Then the devil, seeing that the man has nothing belonging to him, retires in disorder. Needless to say, this description isn't entirely accurate, but it's another example of the bestiary foregoing the facts in favor of the story. The natural history of the beaver was more or less consistent throughout the Middle Ages. It wasn't until a few hundred years later that popular encyclopedias would question the behaviors their predecessors took as fact. But in the case of describing our next creature, it seems that no two medieval volumes agreed. Today, when we hear the word mermaid, most of us know exactly what to imagine: a half-woman, half-fish hybrid. In some depictions, they are beautiful creatures who lure men to their watery graves, while in others they're curious and friendly. In the latter case, we might also imagine a singing lobster of some kind. But whatever your mental image, the truth is that mermaids have a long history, beginning with ancient creatures known as sirens. Now, very technically, sirens and mermaids are different creatures altogether. But by the time of the Middle Ages, the two had become so conflated that the terms were often used interchangeably. This merging of the two concepts persists even into the modern era. For example, the French word for mermaid is sirène, and both Spanish and Italian use sirena. Manatees, often thought to be a source of mermaid sightings by sailors, belong to the order Sirenia, a word directly derived from those ancient legends. To understand these creatures and the bestiaries that presented them, we'll have to travel all the way back to the 8th century BCE. In the epic poem Odyssey, legendary Greek author Homer describes these creatures as follows: "To the sirens first shalt thou come, who beguile all men whosoever comes to them. Whoso in ignorance draws near to them and hears the siren's voice, he nevermore returns, that his wife and little children may stand at his side rejoicing. But the sirens beguile him with their clear-toned song as they sit in a meadow, and about them is a great heap of bones of moldering men, and round the bones the skin is shriveling." Though Homer gave no physical descriptions, artwork dating back to the 7th century BCE illustrates these sirens as bird-like, with only the head of a woman. The image of a human-bird hybrid persisted for several hundred years. It's difficult to say what ancient readers thought of the siren. In foregoing a physical description of any kind, it seems unlikely that Homer intended to present these creatures as grounded in our plane of reality. Over the centuries, a game of mythological telephone was underway, and by the 1st century CE, Pliny the Elder makes it clear that some people thought of the bird-like sirens as very real, though he wasn't exactly convinced. Nor yet do the sirens obtain any greater credit with me, though Dinon, a celebrated writer, asserts that they exist in India, and that they charm men by their song and, having first lulled them to sleep, tear them to pieces. Interestingly, Pliny also describes creatures he calls nereids, claiming that one was found off the coast of Lisbon. He remarks that as opposed to the common notion of a smooth skin, fully human upper body, the portion of the body that resembles the human figure is rough all over with scales. For now, the two concepts were still distinct, but the image of the siren was evolving. In roughly the 8th century, an Anglo-Saxon book of monsters began to circulate, appropriately named the Liber Monstrorum. In it, sirens are described as sea girls who deceive sailors with the outstanding beauty of their appearance and the sweetness of their song, and are most like human beings from the head to the navel, with the body of a maiden, but have scaly fishes' tails with which they always lurk in the sea. The Bern Physiologus, a 9th century copy of the earlier Latin Physiologus, described sirens as bird-like, but in contrast featured illustrations of mermaids. But it was the bestiaries of the 12th and 13th centuries that truly began to cement the depiction of sirens as part human and part fish. Often these illustrations presented a siren or mermaid holding a carp or eel, symbols of evil. In true bestiary fashion, the siren itself, known for its seductive song, became the embodiment of sinful temptation. In some ways, the evolution of the siren mirrors the evolution of the bestiary itself. For many of the creatures they present, we can trace a history back to ancient mythology. Over time, exemplified in the Physiologus, these legends began to cross into reality, if only in certain people's imaginations. Then, as the church became more and more influential, creatures, both real and imagined, became vessels of virtuous instruction. Though each of these phases served their cultural purposes, none would last forever. Eventually, belief in the existence of mermaids and other fantastic creatures, however obscure such beliefs may have been in the first place, began to dwindle. By the late 13th and 14th centuries, encyclopedias began to occupy the shelf space that once belonged to the bestiary. Rather than focusing on allegory and moral interpretations, works from authors such as Jacob van Merlent, Bartholomeus Anglicus, and more sought to compile knowledge from a vast number of disciplines, from philosophy to geography and astronomy to botany. Though these texts included similar descriptions and illustrations in their sections on animals, they often stripped away the Christian symbolism altogether. Though there were certainly exceptions, as with the travels of Sir John Mandeville, the trend of the day was moving toward a more scientific approach. Eventually, the very definition of bestiary began to change. In 1607, for example, Edward Topsell published his famous The History of Four-Footed Beasts, which, though it still contained a fair amount of error, and even included a few mythical creatures, was far more concerned with the true nature of the creatures it presented. To illustrate this point, in his chapter on the beaver, Topsell addresses the idea that this creature would tear off its own stones to escape hunters. It hath been an opinion of some, that when a beaver is hunted and is in danger to be taken, she biteth off her own stones, knowing that for them only her life is sought. In this and all other honest discourses of any part of philosophy, the only mark whereat every good student and professor ought to aim must be verity and not tales. Their stones are very small, and so placed in their bodies as are a boar's, and therefore impossible for them to touch or come by them. They cleave so fast unto their back that they cannot be taken away, but the beast must of necessity lose his life. And therefore ridiculous is their relation, who likewise affirm that when it is hunted, having formerly bitten off his stones, that he standeth upright and showeth the hunters that he hath none for them, and therefore his death cannot profit them, by means whereof they are averted and seek for another. Gradually, the bestiary of the Middle Ages was replaced, and the fanciful illustrations and descriptions became outdated, replaced with scientific observations and drawings that emphasized accuracy. Certainly, this progress toward rational knowledge was a good thing, but after all of this, it does leave us with one big question. What are we to make of the medieval bestiary? Are they a completely archaic medium, useful only to those whose minds were content to let religion obscure reality? Or are they a product of a time when wonder and mystery were easier to come by? A time when nature spoke to us in a divine language, now lost to the ages? These are questions I will leave to you, dear traveler. But whatever your interpretation may be, it's undeniable that the history of the bestiary is a fascinating one. It's hard to study these books and come away without a greater appreciation for our own history, the evolution of our culture, and even nature itself. Because even though we may never be scalded by the dung of a bonneton, or build a campfire on the back of a whale, or observe a pelican raise its young from the dead, the real world is full of even greater wonders, and we are privileged to be a part of it. If you enjoyed this video and want to explore more fascinating and bizarre creatures, be sure to check out these videos. And until next time, thanks for watching, and remember, you matter.